As we reported last week, controversy continues to swirl around what's called that dubia, a request for clarity made by 4 cardinals concerning the apostolic exhortation Amoris Laetitia. Cardinals Burke, Meisner, Brandmuller, and Caffarra asked Pope Francis privately and then publicly to address confusion that they say exists within his teaching regarding communion for divorced and remarried Catholics. I recently moderated a panel at Assumption College in Massachusetts where we examined the document and the reaction to it. Papal Posse member Raymond Arroyo, former USCCB President Archbishop Joseph Kurtz, and Worcester Bishop Robert McManus, as well as theologian Margaret Harper McCarthy, and I engaged in an often spirited discussion about what Amoris Laetitia means to marriage and the family. Here are some highlights.
I tried to think of how do we boil down in just a few words what we should say about Amoris Laetitia. I always love to go to the first sentence, and so the first sentence is really worth our pausing. It says, the joy of love experienced in the family is also the joy of the church. So the spotlight is on the joy of love experienced within the family itself. Our Holy Father is asking us to consider the beauty of marriage and family. Just go to paragraph 11. Listen to this. The couple that loves and begets life is a true living icon, capable of revealing God the Creator and Savior. And then he says, faithful love becomes a symbol of God's inner life. The very love and the beauty of marriage, which is the first thing that we have to remember with the joy of love, is indeed, to our Holy Father, that communion is indeed a reflection of the very inner life of the Trinity. To me, the key takeaway is the missionary family. Our Holy Father is basically saying, I believe, if you want to look at renewal of family life within our church and within our society, the primary agent will be the witness of loving families.
What are the pastors of the church called to do in response to Amoris Laetitia? The 3 key words that repeatedly found in the document are the words of accompaniment, discernment, and integration, before and after marriage. And I think that's, as Archbishop Kurtz talked about, I think the Catholic Church tries to do a good job in preparation for marriage, but I think we need to do more in accompany people after those first several years of marriage. I also see that that the Holy Father wants us pastors, bishops, to accompany people according to, as he says in paragraph 300 of the document, that especially these so-called irregular situations. The classic example would be Catholics who were married sacramentally, divorced, and remarried civilly without an annulment. The Holy Father says that some of the salient moral teachings of the Church, the traditional received teaching, are the distinction between what is objectively wrong and the degree of subjective culpability of the people involved in the wrongdoing. I think another very moral, spiritual, pastoral dimension of the teaching is this ongoing call to conversion. If there's something that's integral to accompaniment and to discernment and to integration, is the call to conversion, that all of us are being called to grow further in the life of Christ.
I feel obliged to bring up some more troubling elements in the document, because I think otherwise we won't be dealing with the document as it is. The whole process by which this document came about is a strange one. And I don't mean this as a criticism of any bishop who took part in this or the Holy Father, but there's something strangely odd about how we got to where we are and what we have, okay? Because all the things that were said by the previous panelists are certainly true. But about those key points, such things as, do we give communion to the divorced and remarried without the benefit of an annulment? On those points, we do not know what the meaning of Amoris Laetitia is. We only now think we have an idea of what some of those hot button points mean because of a letter sent by the Holy Father to a group, not all the Argentinian bishops, but a group of Argentinian bishops saying this is the only possible interpretation, and the interpretation seems to say that some people in these tough circumstances may receive Holy Communion, even though that has certainly not been part of the tradition of the Western, it's not been part of the Western Church. And even that letter was not publicly acknowledged by the Vatican until it had been leaked, and then it became impossible. So bizarre. I know it's a strong word, but I think we've got to find some way to talk about a process that I don't think in recent memory we've seen anything like it in the production of a document. Can anyone really say what Amoris Laetitia says about these questions, even after this Argentinian letter?
This is where I'd like to start, because our topic technically assigned by Assumption College is faithful continuity or departure from tradition. Why was it necessary to have 2 synods and a teaching document on the family when barely 2 decades earlier John Paul II had convened the bishops and written this magisterial document, Familiaris Consortio, which has yet to be fully implemented or understood by the body Catholic? Let's start there.
Let's begin by saying, first of all, what a synod is.
Yeah.
And remember, the synod's work is not to create doctrine. It is to provide advice to the Holy Father. So the relatio is not given to the world, it's given to the Pope. And I think that's very important for us to know. After 6 months, I get the feel that what was presented was something that is solid tradition now over 6 months, and I just don't agree with that. I think you're spinning it much too quickly, going on this soundbite and that soundbite. So I don't quite agree with that. I agree with Robert in saying we have to take the words themselves. And the words themselves, those of you who will read the document, say very clearly there is no intent to create new doctrine. There's no canonical change that's in this document. I would also say this, which I think is very, very important. The footnotes that deal with discernment are vague. There's no doubt about it.
But let's bring people up to speed on those footnotes. Footnote 351, which is the biggie,
Right.
which says you can accompany people who are divorced and remarried without an annulment, and that accompaniment may include the sacraments.
But it doesn't say which sacraments. I mean,
Well,
really,
then there's the footnote.
Go ahead.
It says in certain cases this can include the help of the sacraments.
But he talks about the
talks about-
confessional not being a torture chamber.
That right.
And
then
that
communion should
having
be
remedy.
a reward.
A reward, exactly. There was a choice, and I think a particular cardinal was mentioned a few times. There was a choice in the relatio, to choose a penitential pathway, which would have been a change. That was not accepted within the synod itself, and it was not accepted by Pope Francis. So I think it's very important that we don't spin out now on the basis of what I would call unclear footnotes. I would agree with that. But I think to spin out of that into a full direction on synodality, I agree we need to give much more attention to the question of synodality. It's one thing to adopt or to adapt things to a particular culture. It's another thing to fracture unity. And I've spoken, obviously, at the synod about that myself. So I would tend to agree with you. I don't have the same, you used the word bizarre. I don't have that, I would not characterize Amoris Laetitia in that way. My grave concern is that we have now done what, unfortunately, press have done at this session. We've become myopic. We have focused it almost like in a laser fashion to a footnote instead of looking at 324 paragraphs. And these paragraphs, I think, can have a great effect on renewal of marriage in the church.
I tend to agree that there are those 300-plus paragraphs, but I mean, that is contiguous and follows on from all that went before it. The reason, and now I'm going to defend even my ignorant friends in the press, the press naturally seizes on, and the public, I would imagine many of you came away more focused on what? The footnote. The footnote and divorce and remarried and can you get communion. That became, because in the popular mind after the Casper World Tour, including appearing on my show, we did our jiu-jitsu thing, but he laid out his case, and then it became almost this global match between those who wanted to hold on to, and I'm going to quote this and then we can discuss it. Familias Consortio, which is John Paul II's document, says, the Church affirms her practice, which is based upon sacred scripture, of not admitting to Eucharistic communion divorced persons who have remarried. They are unable to be admitted thereto from the fact that their state and condition of life objectively contradict that union of love between Christ and the Church which is signified and effected by the Eucharist. Besides this, there's another special pastoral reason. If these people were admitted to the Eucharist, the faithful would be led into error and confusion regarding the Church's teaching about the indissolubility of marriage. So why is this new, there is a discernment path that has been opened here in Amoris Laetitia. Why is that not an error or confusing?
I agree that things are confusing, there's no doubt, and I agree with Bob in what he said about that. I do think there are ambiguities, which are the reason for the ambiguity, but you read a papal document according to a hermeneutic of continuity, according to what the papacy is, who is judged inside the tradition, and again, given the fact that the reasons for the perennial discipline are theological, they're tied to the nature of marriage, the nature of the Eucharist, the relation between them, given the fact that Amoris Laetitia never mentioned that, it's proper to assume that that's being taken for granted. It's proper to assume that. Since everybody knows that culpability was never the reason for the discipline. Culpability was never the reason. So, that gives rise to confusion, I agree. But in the proper reading of a papal document, you take for granted the reasons that have always been underlying the discipline. And furthermore, were there to be a change of discipline, I believe that there can't be, because it would touch precisely on doctrine, and then it would in effect be a change of doctrine. That it would at the very least have to be made explicitly.
I would agree.
But I do agree
But
that
Mary,
there's ambiguity.
But Margaret, if that were the case, right? If that were the case, it could be stated very clearly in the document.
I hear you.
And I want to make it clear,
hear
I'm
you.
not saying that the document is bizarre. What I'm saying is that there's this strange process that now goes on. There's some sort of built-in
Yes,
ambiguity that allows itself to be taken off in a strange way. And but I will say this, the letter to the Argentinians, which seems to allow for communion for the divorced and
Here's what the Argentinians wrote and the Pope affirmed, okay? They said, they have a series of things that go through a journey of faith, and they're talking about divorced and remarried people without an annulment. And they say, it is equally possible to undertake a journey of discernment if one arrives at the recognition that in their particular case, there are limitations that diminish responsibility and culpability, particularly to the sacraments of reconciliation and the Eucharist. Okay? So that's saying there are mitigating circumstances where people can be divorced, remarried, and without an annulment, go to the sacraments. The Pope writes, the document is very good and completely explains the meaning of chapter 8 of Amoris Laetitia, where the footnote appears. There are no other interpretations.
Yeah.
That's not troubling?
Well, let me say this. We're talking about a document in which our Holy Father has, first of all, said that there's no change in doctrine. Mm-hmm. He has said that. Now, we could have quoted that part too.
Okay.
It's
no, he does say that.
I said when I began my remarks that the discernment is ambiguous and vague. And there's no question about that. Now, you're talking about, our purpose tonight is not necessarily to talk about what one group of bishops have done or another, but rather the document itself.
Bishop McManus, doesn't the document, I mean, even in the vagueness of the document, and taken what the Holy Father said to the Argentinian bishops, it would seem that this issue of whether to allow a couple to return to communion really now falls to the parish priest in his discernment, right?
Well, I think the Catholic way of interpreting a papal document or exhortation encyclical, the Catholic hermeneutic is one of continuity. I think, as you said, we bring that presumption. And I think for the only chapter that might indicate maybe a break of continuity is the neuralgic chapter 8. As a diocesan bishop who's concerned about how this is going to be taught in the Diocese of Worcester, that chapter, paragraph 300 has been very helpful to me. The point I'm making is that it says that the pastors of the church, e.g. the bishop, working with his priest, they are to address these irregular situations. Remember, these irregular situations run a gamut. They can be from a man and a woman who are cohabitating, who are free to marry, that's an irregular situation, to a situation toward the end of the spectrum, which is Catholics who are divorced, remarried without annulment, to the far end of the spectrum would be same-sex marriages. All irregular situations. The Holy Father says in the document, the pastors must address these situations, A, according to the traditional teaching of the church and the guidelines drawn up by the bishop. I'm a bishop who's a big supporter of continuity in the faith. So I went through from 1981, which is from the Irish Consortio, to this very day, there are no fewer than 8 magisterial documents, some papal and some from Congregation of Doctrine of the Faith, which were approved in what they call in Latin forma specifica, specifically approved by the Holy Father, that says that someone who is a Catholics who are married outside the church, in the second marriage, civil marriage without annulment, are objectively in an adulterous state, and they cannot receive the Eucharist. That's the objective teaching of the church. Now, if it seems that some are arguing that some Catholics who do not have the annulment are in a civil marriage, they can receive the sacraments, the question becomes, is that development of doctrine continuity, or is it not? And I think to say that it is a development of document turns the famous classical example of Cardinal Newman on its head. I don't think it's continuity. I think it's a mistake in theology.
You want to add? I can see you both champing at the bit. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, so the famous footnote comes right after where he makes the point that's a classic point, that persons living in an objective situation of sin may be not subjectively culpable, and as we know, it's subjective culpability that decides whether or not you've committed a mortal sin or not, and that allows you to go to the Eucharist or not. The point is, it's a red herring as far as the marriage and divorce question is concerned, because that is not the reason the Church has ever given for why remarried persons without the benefit of annulment cannot go to the Eucharist. And
explain what the reason is.
The reason is the incompatibility between the objective situation of being effectively a divided person. Jesus provides a rule without exception, so to speak. You can't do this anymore. Moses let you do it. And the argument behind what he says, including these harsh words, is that when you marry someone, you are, if you will, ontologically bound to that person. If you married a second person, you'll be married to 2 people at once, or you'll be married to one person committing adultery. That's the reason. You're a divided soul. And the Eucharist is a sacrament of a one flesh, undivided soul, so to speak. So that's what it's about.
Yeah.
The fact that it's never mentioned, I think it's unfortunate. I agree, there are many unfortunate things, and it has unleashed so much confusion. But it would have to be in a papal document, if the discipline were overturned, it would have to be explicitly stated. The reasons would have to be given. Reasons would have to be given why the old reasons no longer obtain. And then, in my opinion, it would be a doctrinal change.
So the practical change, the pastoral change would beget, or in fact imply and demand, a doctrinal change.
I think so.
Is there a pastoral change here, in your opinion, bishops? And then I'm going to go to Rob.
I think which is very helpful, is that the pastoral change is in this whole notion of discernment, of accompaniment, discernment, and integration. I think that is, for many of us, I think that is a wake-up call. You know, that this is the pastoral style that should be adopted. We don't slam the rectory door in people's face, you know, you're divorced, you're married, get out of here, I don't want to hear anything. The pastoral change. But the pastoral practice has to be rooted in sound Catholic doctrine. And when you're talking about the nature of marriage, either a natural institution or as a sacrament, and you're talking about the reality of adultery, you're talking about, these are not, in the old days we had theological notes. This is not like a common opinion. This is defined Catholic faith. This is rooted in divine revelation and the natural moral law. You can't fool around with that.
Yeah.
So the pastoral practice, and as Pope Benedict has said repeatedly, mercy without truth is not mercy.
And I would also add exactly to what Bishop McManus is saying, that the tone of pastoral practice should not be underestimated. I mean, when you say, well, it's only a reaching out tone, no, that's a very, very important tone. But for us to break the bond between worship, belief, and pastoral practice, I think will be a mistake.
There were 45 theologians who signed a letter very concerned that there was a shift taking place here because they were holding up a contiguous marriage, a long-lasting marriage, as an ideal and not something somehow obtainable. Do you want to comment on that? And where do you think the confusion comes from, given all that we've heard?
Well, I want to say again, because I agree with both of the bishops, same with Margaret. Look, marriage is in a bad way. I mean, we all know this. And one of the clear things that Francis has tried to do is to apply the medicine of mercy particularly in the West. I was very struck during the Synod how different the problems were in Africa, in Asia, Latin America. You know, this is primarily a Western question about divorce. So he's trying to reach out, and of course you accompany people and you try to bring them back into the fold, or do whatever you can with them. And a lot of the places where that question is discussed, it talks about growth. I mean, when everybody was going crazy toward the end of the 2015 Synod, I kept pointing to those, for my readers, I kept saying, well, look, this is about growth. It's not talking about just doing it. It's bringing people to grow closer to the truth and to the life of the church. However, I think that what the 45 theologians are worried about, we don't want to get too much into the weeds here, but
it's needed.
You know, there's a famous passage from John Paul II's Familiaris Consortio, number 84, where he goes through accompaniment and this sort of thing, but then says definitively, but this cannot lead to communion for the divorced,
which I read earlier,
and remarried. And I have to say to both the bishops, it worries me tremendously that the Diocese of Rome seems to have said explicitly it's going to give communion to divorced and remarried, whereas Florence has said no. I have to assume that the Holy Father has agreed, has at least signed off on what looks like that. And again, we don't know. We don't know. But the way that this has gone on is the form of it, let alone whether we know the content or not, the form of it has given rise to so much turmoil in a world where we're all digitally connected, where there are tweets going out, Facebook commentaries that just provoke more and more confusion. And I don't think we can blame people for being confused or for being nervous. My wife, women always understand this better than men. My wife always says people are afraid in the modern world and they want answers. You know, even if they aren't perfect answers, they want answers.
When my wife first heard Cardinal Casper, forgive me, Cardinal Casper, lay out his plan, she said very indignantly when I got home that night, you know what this is? I said, what? This is open season on First Wives. I said, Rebecca, please. But one has to look at this. Look, I get the intentionality. The intentionality is to reach out and offer mercy to people who are struggling and in tough situations, and they exist. Are you concerned that the practical reality is you will have examples of people who are allowed to go to communion in one parish and forbidden to do so in the other, and there'll be the what about me routine. And that starts to crush in on the doctrine, and inevitably it has to give to the human consideration. Or you're not a nice person, Bishop.
Well,
Which is worse than being a heretic today.
yes. Which question do you want me to answer?
Both of them. Both of them.
Yeah. Let me begin by saying this, that I think within the Archdiocese of Louisville, where I am, I think we have unity. Mm-hmm. And I think it's very important to know, when we heard from almost 60 of our bishops throughout the United States, they talked about the effect of this document, and it's very different than what we're hearing tonight in the panel. I'm glad we're hearing this, because we want it to be an honest discussion and debate, no question. But it's not the typical thing when I'm going to parishes. Now, I think it's the vagueness that I think is going to need clarification. There's no question in my mind. I think the clarification is going to have to come, as I see it, from the efforts of our Holy Father and all of us as bishops participating in this, in being able to show that our efforts to adapt things to culture is not going to bring about the fraction of unity. And I think that's what I'm hearing very much from Robert, and who would not be concerned about that, of course. But I must go back to the beginning, and maybe people who are here tonight would be able to say that. When I'm interacting, and I go to a lot of parishes, there are many things on people's minds, but the confusion that you're raising tonight is not the first thing that they're talking to me about. I must admit that. And it is something that we have to address and resolve.
They're growling at you, Bishop.
Do it.
They're grumbling. Well, I will tell you, I think it's the ad hoc nature of it that so many of the correspondence that I've received. It worries people when they see, they're not worried about the American bishops, because I think you all are of one mind. You get it, you have your own take on it, and I do think you're attempting that. But in other places, in other countries, you're seeing an ad hoc approach to this, and is that a danger? And does that fracture unity and weaken the doctrine?
I would just appeal in terms about how disparate practice can affect the universality of the Church. I mean, there's a time-honored Latin phrase that liturgists use. I mean, I'm not a liturgist, by the way. It's lex orandi, lex credendi. The law of praying is the law of believing. Now, if in point of fact, this Eucharistic practice works out in the way Robbie referred to, the Diocese of Rome is doing X, Archdiocese of Florence is doing Y, if that spreads, then actually the way we are praying is going to affect what we believe. And I think and I would not argue for a return to a formal practice, but I think, let's be honest, I think communion in the hand some way, on some level, has affected Catholic piety about the Eucharist. I'm not arguing for that. But I think let's learn from our pastoral practice and the reception of communion in terms of one's spiritual suitability is far more important, I think, than how we receive communion.
Right.
To me, it was always a heartache that so much attention was focused on controversies and so little on building up the family. I think Archbishop Kurtz, you gave a beautiful presentation of what is actually in there. And it's if you haven't read the document, it really is worth reading it for the kind of inspirational side of what's in there. This is a man who's got, the Pope is a man with great charisms and great ability to touch people with where they are. I mean, there's no debate about that at all. But because of some extraneous things and some odd things that happened within the Vatican, like the first interim relatio in 2014, that positive dimension, I mean, we need to build up marriages in the modern world. I mean, it's one thing, as the Pope says always about the field hospital, you know, there's a war going on and you try to patch people back up. But you also got to get out there and either win the war against the secular destruction that is coming toward marriage out of the culture, or at least lessen it. So we've got to be able to build our people up and not just, I think that is even a much more important function that maybe the document leads us to, then cleaning up at the point where people are virtually, dead from what is floating around in the culture and has harmed their marriages.
Well, I want to thank the panel. And thank you all for being here and for spending time on something that is of such importance. Marriage and the Church's understanding of it. It is the center of who we are and who we will be.